All right, good afternoon. We will go ahead and get started. I think we've got folks in the room and want to honor that time. So, as a note, you probably know already that the session is being recorded. The recording will be available after some editing on our website, over the next few weeks. But did want to let you know that we are recording this session. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And if you are able to turn on your camera, please do. I think this is not going to be a one-way presentation. This is going to be a multi collaborative presentation today. So be great to be able to see who's out there in our Zoom world as we get going. So my name's Dr. Julie Shedd. I am the Associate Dean at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, as well as being an alum of the program twice. I got my master's and PhD, as well as being a faculty member and a practitioner. And the purpose of today's session is really to think about how we in our everyday lives are interacting with conflict, and how we as conflict resolution practitioners or people that are hoping to do something about conflict can address that. And this is not going to be a presentation where I'm going to be talking at you. You all are going to be talking amongst yourselves and doing some work together as we go through this. So what I'm really geared towards doing is inviting us to think about what are some of the conflicts in the world that we care about, what are some of the ways we understand those conflicts, and what are some of the strategies or opportunities we have for addressing that, and as practitioners intervening in that. To that end, maybe let me say a little bit more about some of the work that I do. So my academic training was in thinking about extremist violence, and particularly how we talk about violence, media coverage of violence, and how that impacts the conflicts they're in. But over the last really 10 years or so, most of my work has started to focus much more locally and with local communities and organizations. So for instance, I've run a long program, many years running program with the local libraries to do media literacy and dialogue training, so that we're actually helping members of communities learn how to research issues and talk about conflicts that matter to them better. I've been working for the last 5 or so years with the Virginia Department of Education to bring external facilitators into special education conflict, and working with families and schools who are trying to figure out how to sort through what the best needs for their children are. In this local area here in Northern Virginia, you may have heard about some of the controversies around Confederate legacy items, statues, street names, seals, symbols, markers, all those kinds of things that celebrate the South and the Confederacy and the American Civil War. And I've spent a lot of time working with communities to make decisions collectively about how they want to deal with those street names and markers and monuments, and then put forward those decisions as part of political processes. So the decision makers are actually deciding to change names or make other arrangements. So any of you who are local may know that on Tuesday, last Tuesday, Fairfax County voted to change the name of Lee Highway and Lee Jackson Memorial Highway. And then last month, Fairfax City voted to change their street names as well, that were related. And so those are processes that I facilitated the community part of those processes, bringing those community leaders together to make those recommendations. So when I think about everyday conflicts, so the title of this session is Conflict Resolution 2022 Everyday Impacts. What I'm really interested in is how we work with institutions and with communities and groups to try to deal with the conflicts that all of us are engaging with every day. I really care about world peace. I care about big picture international conflict, but that's where I'm seeing the leverage for myself, is how do we actually try to deal with those conflicts in the everyday. And so that's kind of where I want to focus today. So the first thing I actually want to do is I'm going to put a link up in the chat to a Jamboard. And I don't know if y'all ever used Jamboard before. I am going to show it to you also. But the first thing I actually want you to do is, if you could go in and on this Jamboard, I'm going to ask you to make a Post-it note, and I'm going to show you how to do it. But I want you to spend maybe 30 seconds thinking about a conflict that you care about in the world. Something that's happening, could be locally, it could be in your community, it could be in a group. Could be in an organization, something that you care about in the world. And it could be kind of any kind of conflict. So I wouldn't necessarily do something that's happening within one person, right? Inner psychic conflict within their own brain, but conflict that's happening between people, either at the interpersonal, small group, community, organizational, or national, international level. Something you care about that you wish you could do something about. And when you go to the link in the chat where I just put the Jamboard link, hopefully you can see that. you can actually go into the Jamboard right here. And Leslie, you can do this with the group that's there, right? Or someone can go on behalf of the group that's there. And this little tab right here says sticky note, right? To make a sticky note, and you can type the title of the conflict you're interested in, and you can place it somewhere here on this board where you feel like it kind of fits in that interpersonal, small group, community, organizational, or national, international. So I'm going to stop talking and give you about 30 seconds to come up with a conflict and put it up there and see where we land. So see where we go. All right, I see some big picture conflicts going up, the ongoing political and economic crisis in Lebanon, conflicts in Korea, refugee crisis in the Middle East. Great. Land boundaries, class conflict. Okay. Nice. Okay, so we've got some on different kinds of rights, class conflict. Okay, safe streets. How is safe or not for people in the neighborhood? Got it. Hopefully you all can see some of these also while they're building, right? While you're on the web page. This is a great list. And someone put up within a worker center, what is and you can put it in the chat if you can't talk, but what's the context of a worker center? What does that mean? Conflict between siloed groups within a worker center. All right, I'm going to leave this going and move us on. So you can keep going. We're going to use the same Jamboard for the whole session. So you can keep it up, keep the link going, and keep adding to it if you want to in terms of conflicts that you're concerned about. And if you think that we may not know just from the title what it is, you could just give us a little bit more detail, would be helpful. All right, I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute. That Jamboard's still there. You can keep doing it, but we're just not going to be looking at it together. So as a conflict practitioner, the first thing that I'm thinking about once I start looking at a conflict that I'm interested in. So for instance, if I'm doing something in my own work where I'm thinking about Confederate legacy, right? Confederate legacy items, and I've got a community, for instance, that may be asking for help in trying to determine what to do. So let me use as an example a process that I worked with Fairfax City. And this started with the community manager, the city manager coming to me with a group of the city staff, including someone from historic preservation, as well as the city clerk and 2 of the city council members. And they essentially said, hey, we've got this conflict around Confederate legacy items in our city. We have 20-ish, 25 street names that have a Confederate implication, right? Either directly named something like Plantation or Rebel, or in one of the neighborhoods, things that were definitely associated with the movie Gone with the Wind, right? So names like Scarlet and things like that. They also had a city seal on that all their police officers and on all the city vehicles had a Confederate soldier on it, right, on the city seal. And then throughout the city, there was a variety of historic markers and monuments, for instance, in the cemetery that were put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy. So they had this whole set of questions that they needed to ask in the community, and they were looking for some help with how do we actually understand what's going on. And someone who's trying to do conflict resolution practice, the first thing I had to do was ask a lot of questions. And so I want to have us do that together. So in thinking about, what do we need to know about a conflict to know how we might intervene? So this first step, right, was really thinking about conflict mapping. And sometimes it actually is visual mapping, trying to identify where in the world or what are boundaries or how are groups located next to each other. But what's actual conflict mapping? How do I start to understand what's happening in this conflict? And I'm going to get you all to do this here in just a second. But I want you to focus on 2 parts of conflict that we're really working through. The first one is, who are the parties? Are there core parties to this conflict? Can you identify who the parties are, right? Are there subgroups within those parties? So for instance, in the case that I was working with, there was a city council, which was certainly a party to this conflict, right? They're the ones that are going to be trying to help make decisions. But there was real divisions within the city council about what should be done, right? And how we should manage this. There was members of the community who were from historical preservation societies who felt very, very strongly about preserving these markers and monuments and street names. There's a national movement, right? There's been national attention on these issues. So we had parties that were local to what was happening. And then we also had parties that were much, much bigger picture nationally. One of the stories that was being told by people as I started to ask questions was that this entire conflict was being funded and like pushed and promoted by parties outside the community, and that people were using this for kind of national leverage, right? So there was the set of core conflict parties. Who do I care about that's local to this conflict? Who are some internal groups of those parties? What are some of the relationships between the parties involved? So are they symmetrical in the sense that the parties have an equal amount of power? Are they asymmetrical in that one party has a lot more power than another? And many of you who may have a political science class may recognize that there's lots of different kinds of power, right? There's formal power, there's informational power, there's relational power, but there's lots of different ways that the parties might be related. And then is there leaders of the parties that we should be paying attention to, and how do the goals of the leaders match up with the goals of the membership? So for me, a lot of the research I've done is on terrorist violence, right? In those cases, many of the goals of the leadership are not necessarily the same thing as the goals of the members of those groups, for a lot of really complicated reasons. And then I want you to look at conflict issues. You may have heard of the idea of positions, interests, and needs. So positions are the thing that I come in and tell you I want, right? So if I am anti these street signs, my position may be that I think all these street names should change, that all dozen or 25 of them should change. My interest, though, might be underneath that, which is that maybe my interest is in having an inclusive community, an inclusive, vibrant community where people feel welcome. And for me, having these street signs means that I'm not meeting that interest, because I'm understanding that people are feeling excluded by these signs. But then my underlying need may be one about fairness or diversity or value. So the idea is that often we have a conflict at the level of positions, right? We're arguing about the position we're taking, but really what's underlying that is some interest that we might have or needs that we're trying to meet, and that we're engaging in conflict in a much more complicated way. What are some of the perceptions by the parties of the causes or of the nature of the conflict? What do the parties themselves think is happening? And this is tricky for us because we have gotten into this era of relativism, right? Where we assume that everything is, where there's a pressure to assume that everybody's point is equally valid. That's not where I'm heading with this. Where I'm heading is that if we were trying to deal with conflict, we have to understand how the parties are understanding the conflict. Like what do they think is happening in this conflict? We may not agree with it, and it might be something that there may be objective information that would say that's not the case. But as someone who's doing conflict, that actually doesn't matter, right? Whether or not what they're doing, it matches up with objective facts doesn't matter. What matters is how they're perceiving the conflict, how they're perceiving the situation. And again, that doesn't mean that we're giving validity to every opinion as being equally valid. What it means is as a practitioner trying to deal with it, I have to deal with people where they are, with the perceptions that they're bringing into the table and the perception they're bringing to the conflict. And I may think that they don't have much validity or value, but that's I can carry that opinion inside my own heart, right? But in my conversation and my work, I'm dealing with them with their perceptions. And what's the current behavior of the parties? How are they matching up? So I actually want to move us. I'm going to do, if I can, real quick. Here we go. How many people are we? So Leslie, I'm going to have your group be one group there in the undergrad module, and as opposed to, I'm going to put you in a breakout room, kind of all of your own, if that's okay. But then I want to go ahead and put, I'm going to make us into 6 groups or so. And what I want your group to do, and I might hope that I know we have in the session some folks that have gone through quite a bit of conflict classwork and have even taught some of this. So I'm hoping that when you all are in your groups, if you have a lot of experience, you can help guide and facilitate where we may have folks who don't have as much experience doing this. But I want you to take a run, pick 1 or 2 of these conflicts on the Jamboard, and we're only going to spend maybe about, let's spend about 5 minutes. And I want you to try to identify some of the positions and some of the issues associated with that conflict in the Jamboard, and just go ahead and make another post-it and stick it onto it, right? Like stick it next to that conflict. So when we're looking at the Jamboard, we're seeing both the original conflict and something on those post-it. So your first task is going to be to figure out which of those conflicts on the Jamboard you want to take on. And then your second task is going to be to do one post-it that has who do you think the parties are, and one post-it that has who do you think the issues are. And let me go ahead and get us started real quick. Does that make sense? We okay with directions? All right. So I'm going to do this, and I'm going to have this close after 5 minutes. So this isn't going to be an in-depth mapping. Those of you who are doing conflict coursework, I know you could write entire 20-page papers to do this. I want you to come up with just a high level. What are the positions? What are some of the issues? We're going to go into breakout rooms for 5 minutes, and we're going to come back after 60 seconds and start thinking about what we want to do about it. So here we go. I think we've got pretty much everybody back. I want to actually take a minute and talk about what you came up with, because we're going to be working with your conflicts for the next about 45 minutes or so. So I want everybody to hear what each other we're talking about a little bit. Leslie, could I turn to your group in the room there and have you tell us which conflict you all picked, and maybe just give like 30 seconds to a minute of a highlight of what some of the parties or the issues were that you raised. So the group that's in the module in Fairfax, you have the floor.
I'm going to harassment.
You can see.
Alrighty. My name is Jay, by the way. We did harassment.
Okay.
So the parties that we selected was bosses, classmates, and strangers on the street. You know, sometimes they make these jokes. That's what we picked on the bottom. They make comments or jokes that make the other person uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, you know, during harassment, the person will never speak up, or the person will speak up. And if they do speak up, sometimes the other person wouldn't listen. So, yeah.
So some of the issues were how people are feeling, right, when they're on the other side of the jokes, or feeling uncomfortable, and that maybe people's sense of entitlement to be able to make those kinds of jokes and comments.
Yeah.
Does that seem right? Cool. Okay. So you all were thinking about harassment in kind of the very interpersonal, we're moving past each other in our daily lives and interacting, and it's in ways that are making people uncomfortable.
Yes.
Cool. Great. Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Can I get room 6, which was Arzu, Ayako, or Julie? Can you tell us which conflict you were picking and give us like 30 seconds to a minute about what you thought some of the people were, parties, and issues? And I apologize if I mispronounced anybody's names. Some of you I have a chance to know, and many of you I don't. So I will do my best from seeing your names written in the breakout rooms.
Well, I don't want to jump on my illustrious colleagues, but what we chose was the teaching of LGBTQ plus in classrooms, in grade schools, middle schools, high schools. You know, basically with the conflict parties or being parents, and also, you know, staff, faculty who do or do not want this type of topic addressed in school. So on the one hand, you have those folks who are supportive of the community, see it as a human right, and on the other hand, it's a religious issue commonly for some who are against it, citing certain religions that they say don't support that type of belief. And so these are not, it's not an easy topic, it's not an easy conflict. These are very personal, very difficult aspects to this conflict. So Ayako and Arzu, if you want to speak up, please feel free to jump in.
Thanks.
It's fine, thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, so we've got teaching around, well, and probably policy around in schools around LGBTQ youth. So which just made the news here in Virginia yesterday. I don't know if anybody was aware, but the governor of Virginia announced yesterday that children could only use bathrooms of the gender they were assigned at birth, which is a change in practice. So this is definitely an everyday conflict in the news that we will be seeing as it develops, at least here locally, for the next little while. So great, thanks for bringing that one out. The next room was room 5. Adam, Angela, Ian, Mary. Can someone tell me which conflict you chose and give us 30 seconds or a minute on what you thought some of the parties and issues were?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, I got you, Ian.
Awesome. So we actually decided to choose class conflict. I'm gonna leave some time for other people to speak just in case they want to. So we sort of focused on how poor and working class families sort of and children sort of are taken advantage of by the rich, like the top 1% of most societies. And we took this more in like an international route where you have like children and families within developing worlds that are constantly taken advantage of by multinational corporations and stuff like that.
So
and how they're constantly at odds with each other because of that, and environmental degradation comes on as a result, and a plethora of other issues.
So, well, a big picture kind of international conflict you felt like you took from a national sphere, but the impacts that you were thinking about really were about people's daily lives, and particularly children's daily lives, and what the impacts were on them. Awesome. Anybody else from that group want to chime in? Adam or Mary? Cool. All right, good. We're getting a great spectrum of different kinds of, different types of conflict that we're looking at. So thanks, Ian, for representing that group. Room 4, Seyhoon, Yuriko, or Ziad, anybody want to talk about what conflict you all picked and what those positions and issues were? And I maybe should have told you to select a spokesperson ahead of time. So this is a little bit of ambushing somebody to make you speak. So I apologize for that.
Hello.
Hi, Sam.
So we chose the conflict on Korean Peninsula and talked about the main parties are North and South Korea, and the secondary party could be the US and China. And for the issues, we talked about that North Korea, the leadership doesn't want to lose the power of them, and the people, there are the families and who are separated and do not have the information of each other if they are still alive or so. So this could be one issue. And another one is the unification. So the younger generation in South Korea doesn't want to doesn't want the unification for now, as it will be cost a lot of money and will give lots of burden in their development. Yeah, so that was what we talked about.
Nice, thank you. Anybody, Ziad or Yuriko, want to add anything to that?
And one of the things that we talked about is one of the difficulties of this issue is that there is no communication channel between people to people in two countries. There is only one like top level communication channel. So that's one of the reasons it makes it difficult.
Great, thank you. So the communication, the inability of the parties to actually have a conversation is part of why we're continuing to have that. I think that's a great point and is going to lead into our conversation about roles that we can play in dealing with that in just a minute. So keep that one at top of mind. Let's see, next we've got Ashton, Maki, and Maria. Can you tell us which conflict you picked and who you think the people are and some of the issues?
I can try.
Thank you.
So we picked gender conflict, and I think we said the parties are everybody, but not everybody may recognize that there is a conflict.
Okay.
So that makes it challenging. And then I think we named that some of the interests and needs were safety and positions maybe around like who takes up space in public or who's able to use space in public.
And who feels safe doing so, yeah. Interesting. Yeah, and I think that's one that, you know, getting into that positions, interests, needs mapping is super interesting, right? Because often the positions are laid out as a specific policy or a specific demand, but really getting into the what's underneath that. You know, are people, is it fear? Is it discomfort? Is there a fear of losing control or losing authority? There's a variety of things that I think that's a great example of one that mapping that position's interest and needs really helps us get some leverage to understand what's going on with it. Anything anybody else wants to add, Maki or Ashton, on the looking at gender conflict? All right, so let's go to room 2. Kelly, Jorge, or Janet. What conflict did you pick, and what did you think the people were and the issues were? All right, Jorge, you going to take this one on as the ambushed spokesperson?
I think Kelly is about to speak, so I'm gonna
Oh.
I was actually going to defer to you, Jorge.
All right,
Okay,
you've been voluntold. You've been voluntold, my friend.
As a class, we went from the class conflict and we zoomed in on one that we posed as a class conflict between migrants and communities where these migrants are being bused or where they're entering the country. And then we ended up talking about the conflict between the border states and the northern states, where there are like 3 parts: the governments of the local governments of the border states, local governments of the northern states, and the local government and the migrants themselves. And some of the issues that we see underlying fear, the lack of safety of the migrants in their own countries, and then the fear for safety and insecurity in the border states. And in the northern states that are receiving these migrants, the lack of information about them coming and or how to help them well, also because of lack of experience, I guess. And then we talked about budgetary issues, like as an issue too, where border states take a lot of the blunt of the budget hit by dealing with the thousands of people coming through the border, and then it becomes a budgetary issue for the states receiving them, and especially for the social sector. Yeah, that's kind of as far as we got.
Nice, cool. And you know, this is a great example. I didn't show this tool, right? But some of you have probably seen it, the Mara Dugan's nested model of conflict, where you have a conflict at the very center, but that's embedded in things that are happening in relationships and in systems and in larger systems. And so, you know, in this case, what the conflict that was potentially happening, or the issues happening on Martha's Vineyard over the weekend, right, with the migrants who were dropped off there, who were flown there, was definitely much more embedded, right? There's this national conversation about the border and migration. There's the regional, like you identified, right? Conflict between the northern states and Texas and Texas and Florida, and the governors of those border states, right? And the conflict within Congress. And I mean, there's many different layers of this particular issue. So, you know, if we are trying to think about where is our entry point, and we'll talk more about this, we could enter in many of those different levels, right? To try to figure out how we want to address the fact that we have migrants outside of Kamala Harris's house, right? That have been dropped off there without necessarily a plan for what happens next for them. Thank you, Jorge. Anything, Kelly or Janet, you want to add to that?
I mean, we also
No, for now.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Kelly.
We also just discussed also the job opportunities that, you know, aren't there, and the healthcare challenges also that are coming as a result of this. We're not understanding how to navigate these systems. Janet might want to add more to that.
Not actually, I was about to say the same. Like, it's a team effort, I think. It's like the families coming and families here, try to help each other, but also understand how the system works and the opportunities that may have and may not have. But that's all that we discuss all together. Thank you.
Great, thanks. All right, group 1, Elena, NG, JN, Soyun. what do you think what conflict did you guys resonate with, and what do you think some of the people were in the issues? All right.
I can go. I was hoping some of the other people in our group would.
And you got outweighted. Your ability to live in silence was outlasted by them. So yep, you're up.
Apparently, yeah. So we did the Ukraine war, and we mostly did a verbal exercise. We didn't realize we had to type it out here.
That's okay.
But we just mapped out between Ukraine and Russia, different direct confrontations, and then how other groups are involved, such as the US, EU, NATO, UN, and different indirect conflicts that are occurring in regards to the overarching conflicts. And then positions regarding occupying versus liberating Ukraine, and then interests such as political, economic, cultural, security interests, needs like basic human needs, resources, respect, acknowledgement, security, protection, like all the basic stuff. Yeah, we did it pretty quick.
Okay.
Because it's like a really big conflict, obviously, and this could be a 30-page paper.
Yeah,
we actually like mapped it out. So we kept it high level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This was I knew you weren't going to be able to get to all the detail that you would get to if you were trying to actually write this out or do an intervention plan. But really just wanted to start thinking about, how do we understand what's happening in a conflict so that we can start coming up with a strategy and a plan. We actually switch that. So thank you. Anybody else from that group want to add?
Angie wrote the sticky notes, so I just kind of read our sticky notes. So she was very helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. I want to actually now switch gears a little bit and talk about what are some of the roles that we might play when we're intervening in conflict. And this, I think, is actually really important because many of us who come into the field, I think, come in with a certain kind of person or a certain kind of role in mind that we want to be. And I want to push us a little bit to expand that idea and also think about that any of these conflicts you all have identified, there's going to be multiple kinds of roles that people can play to start addressing that conflict. And we need all of those different kinds of roles. So to give you an example from my own work, right? Much of the work in this last several years that is thinking about Confederate legacies, I was invited to lead a police practices review for Arlington County. I led a process to think about school resource officers and the role they should be playing, having armed police officers in schools. Most of those processes got started following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, right? And they got started because it became a national issue and because people were advocates and they were in the street and they were raising the question and they were putting pressure on local government leaders to make changes, right? So whether they were in the NAACP and they were helping promote a policy agenda, or whether they were an activist who was marching in one of the protests in the street, or they were calling their legislator, right? Or calling their board member or city council member, that role of advocate was super important to get the issue and raise the issue to a level that local elected officials felt like they had to make change, right? They needed to make change. And then there was a different kind of role that became important, right? Then there was a role of what does it look like to work with a system? How do we facilitate conversation? How do we lead dialogue? And those are not necessarily the same person, right? So the same person who may have been the loudest person at the county board meeting demanding change was probably not particularly well positioned to go lead a change process where they were assumed to have some kind of impartiality, right, in terms of leading that change. And so I just give that as an example because the change process wouldn't have happened without the advocates, right? If people had not, and the activists, if they had not been in the street at the city council, at the board meetings demanding change, that change process wouldn't have gotten started. But then there was a role for a different kind of person, different kind of conflict resolver in working with the systems, working with community groups, working with other kind of activists to start to map out what does change look like in a very practical way. And we need both of those things, right? One couldn't have done it without the other. The activists in the street without the actual change process wouldn't have actually gotten concrete results, right? And we wouldn't have gotten those change processes without activists in the street. So So what I want us to do actually next is think about what are some of the different kinds of roles that we play when we're thinking about conflict, and thinking about these 7 that you all have particularly identified. So harassment, LGBTQ treatment in schools, policy in schools, class conflict, and how the implications of potentially global North, global South show up in everybody's everyday, the Korean Peninsula and the political as well as social conflict there, gender conflict and how those roles are playing out in a variety of ways in our society, the border conflict between the northern and southern parts of the United States, and the Ukraine war, right? All of those have impacts on individual people and individual communities in the everyday. And I want to think a little bit about, this is from Bill Urey. Some of you probably have seen this, but it's the idea of that there's a variety of different kinds of roles that we as third-siders, right? And it's not always the case. Sometimes we're not outside the conflict, but that we might be able to play, and that there's a lot of people that matter for dealing with conflict. So in this graph, right, he's got this idea that there's 2 sides in this conflict in the graph. Now we all know that a lot of conflicts have more than 2 sides, but for simplicity's sake, right, we have 2 sides, and that there may be people who are working on the conflict who are insiders. There are people who are known to the parties, their family, their friends, the parties themselves. So some of you, when you're in conflict with others, may use your own conflict skills, right, to help try to design or to diffuse a conflict or work towards resolution. And so we have really important parties who are insiders to those conflicts. And many of us are them. We are them in conflicts in our own lives and in our own communities. And we are, one of the great things about insiders is that we usually know the context, right? We know the people, we know the power relations and the power dynamics. And we have an ability to understand what's happening contextually that's really important. There's also the option to have people that are coming from as outsiders. So whether they are neutrals or bystanders, or maybe neighbors, or sometimes in a family conflict, it might be family members who aren't in that specific conflict, they're a little bit wider out. In the international context, it might be other nations who are not directly involved in the conflict, but have feel a need to intervene. And they play an important role because they aren't conflict parties. They're not directly enmeshed in it. They potentially can be viewed as a little more impartial. I won't even have a conversation about neutrality. That's a super complicated concept in conflict resolution, and we can talk much more about that if in a further practice class or something. But the idea that they might have some independence from the conflict. But they also, as an outsider, one of the things you might not know is you might not know the context. It was really important for me in all the communities I've worked with over these last several years. I did a lot of interviews on the front end, right? I was coming in as an outsider, and that's why they were bringing me in, is that they wanted someone who wasn't in the conflict. But I spent months in each of these cases doing interviews with the local elected leaders, the folks that work in the cities, members that represented activist groups, members that represented people who brought these issues forward. Because it was really important for me to know the context so that I was designing a process that would make sense in that context, and to make sure that I had people who were insiders who were helping me with that design, right? So that the process was going to make sense and we weren't going to get to the end of it and feel like it had just been completely out of place. So William Murray really had this idea in the third side, and I'm sure many of you have probably seen other ways of formulating different roles and how we structure that. But this is one that I think is pretty simple. So I actually want to take this on for our next step, and we're going to talk about these same 7 conflicts. And I'm going to put you back in breakout rooms, and I want to give each room is going to get a role. And here's the role. So notice these aren't titles, right? They're not job titles. They're not what this person would have on their resume, right? It's not what it says they are. It's the role that they're playing in the conflict. So the provider role. So someone who's helping people meet their needs, right? Someone who might be helping to address where there's deficiencies. The conflict parties don't have what they need, either to engage in conflict productively, or in general, they don't have the needs being met that help them be successful. Someone who's teaching, helping people learn how to deal with conflict better. And you can imagine who some might be a bridge builder. So the group that was talking about Korea Peninsula was talking about how we didn't have any lines of communication. So someone who's trying to build bridges between parties, connect them. Someone who's mediating. So mediating in a more official way of trying to help parties communicate and come to some resolution together. An arbiter, somebody who is more of a decider, right? Someone who has some authority to make a decision on the outcome of a particular conflict. an equalizer. So this is someone who's trying to help the parties become what we talked about, asymmetric conflict, right? Who's got more power and who doesn't. Someone who's taking an equalizer role might be trying to help even out that power dynamic in a variety of ways. A healer working on relationships and helping to repair in a conflict space. A witness, really someone, they're watching. So think about the different organizations we have that report on conflict and the role that the media, for instance, plays, right? As witnesses and documenting and writing down what's happening in conflict behavior. A referee who puts limits on the fighting, or someone who's a peacekeeper who might provide protection and security. I'm going to let you all take those very quick phrases, right, and run with them in your groups a little bit. But I'm going to put you back in different groups, and I'm going to put these in the chat, and I'm going to put what group number and which one should be doing what. And I want you to take two of the conflicts that we talked about a few minutes ago. And I'm going to go ahead. Let me get back to my Zoom chat. I'm going to stop sharing that and get back to the Zoom chat. Thank you, Ori, for sharing that. The link to the Bill Urey reference. So here's the conflicts that we were talking about. I'm gonna put them in the chat. They're harassment, LGBTQ plus classrooms, class conflict, the Korean Peninsula, gender, border states versus northern states, and Ukraine war. And what I want you to do is I'm going to have you go into groups. Let me make sure that I have this making sense. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what I want to do for the group that's in Fairfax, it's all together. I'm going to give you guys a couple roles that I want you to split up in your room, right? So split up into groups of 2 or 3 in the room and take these on. So let me put these in the chat. So group 1 is going to be working. I want you to think about, so what I want you to do in this breakout rooms is I want you to think about what the role is, how you would apply that role. Right? How this role, so if you were talking about provider, how would a provider deal with one of those conflicts you're looking at? And then I also want you to talk about what do you think that job might be called? Who's the person that might be brought in to do that, if that makes sense, right? So what would you call someone who's providing that service or providing that element in a conflict? So let me put up, so group 1 through 6 is going to be doing those roles, all right, when I open the rooms. And then I want for the group that is in Fairfax all together, I would like for you all to do, to combine, to do these, sorry. That's not working. I'm about to put them in the chat. So there's four roles that I want the group in Fairfax to split. I want you to split healer, witness, referee, and peacekeeper. So have somebody prepare to talk about it. I want you to spend, let's spend 7 minutes talking through how do you think that role would apply to 2 of the conflicts we've identified. You should have them in the chat, and I can broadcast them again and come back with a spokesperson in about 7 minutes. How do you think they would apply? And what would you call someone who's doing that? Like if they had a job title, what do you think that person would be called addressing that conflict? Does that make sense? We okay? All right, I will hang out if there's questions. You are in different rooms, so you're going to get a chance to meet somebody that you haven't had a chance to meet before. Your room number should be visible to you. If for some reason it's not, definitely let me know. Awesome. I think everybody's back. I'm going to go in the opposite order, and maybe just because I want to make sure that I am cognizant of time. We have about 10 minutes. Maybe I'll get each group to talk about one of the conflicts you thought your role might play, might be able to do something with, and what you think you would call that. So I'm going to start with the Jorge, Mary, Yuriko room 1. What conflict did you all pick, and what did you think your role could do with it?
We can just go. Okay. Jorge. Okay. Jorge has been, he's been muting. Let me just say what we talked about.
Perfect. Thank you.
We took the role of the provider. Okay. And we accepted what are the basic needs of these immigrants. Oh, we were talking about the immigrants who are
Perfect.
So we agreed that the needs, the basic needs that need to be addressed right now is safety, health, work, shelter, and food. Okay, so we identified who are the providers, whether they do it negatively or they do it positively. So we identified that the states, the state mechanisms, whatever happens, like the governor, the county, the state government, right? You have to forgive me, I'm not very familiar with the states, but it is the states authorities, their state local authorities have to provide this. I mean, when the immigrants come, they need to be provided with health, safety, whatever. And we saw that most of those, and also the communities, because within a state, these people are going to a certain community. Within, let's say somebody is going to Texas, I mean, that's a state, but there's that community where they are going to. So whether it depends on whether it is a welcoming community, but we have agreed that those communities are doing very well for their migrants. For all we know, this could be their relatives or whoever. So they are very, very positive and they are doing the best. Then we have the border, the border, the immigration border, whatever. So we understand that those people, yes, they are providing the services. It might not always be out of goodwill, but they are obligated, because this is about the Constitution, about democracy and whatever. So whether that guy at the border doesn't like me or not, he is obligated to facilitate my entry to the United States.
Absolutely.
So that's where we got.
Awesome. And yeah, I mean, the provider role, we have a lot of conflict theory that talks about people behaving with conflict behavior when they're not getting basic needs met, right? And that we have a physiological as well as social emotional need to try to achieve our needs. So someone who's playing a provider role may be thinking about, I may not be directly trying to deal with the conflict behavior, but how can I address the underlying needs that the parties might have that might change their conflict behavior, right? Because now they're no longer trying to seek to achieve those needs. It might just help manage some of the damage that might be happening from the conflict too, right? So perfect. I think those are great examples. Thank you to you guys for sharing those.
Okay.
Let me go to Arzu, Julie, and why
Ilana. Yeah, this is Julie again. So we continued on with the LGBTQ in schools conflicts. In other words, whether or not that should be taught and supported with education and policy. And our role was teaching how to engage appropriately, I would assume, in conflict. And so we explored the idea of assigning conflict coaches as a title, as in two different groups, and then also together. But we looking at the qualifications for these folks. We decided they should be very experienced, because like we discussed before, this conflict or these conflicts are they're deep rooted, they're very personal, and they involve very personal aspects of gender, of religion, of morality, things that are very personal to people, and so they're very difficult to deal with. And so these coaches need to be quite experienced in psychology, in education, were some of the areas we thought would be helpful. And that was our suggestion.
Awesome. And this is a conflict where you may well have parties who are not prepared to advocate for themselves, right? I mean, you may have children and families who are not in a position or don't know what their avenues are for advocating. And so someone who's playing a teaching or a coaching role may help with that. You may have teachers and school administrators who just don't know how to handle the what's happening coming to them from above high from the Department of Education and their responsibilities. So I think that role of teacher or coach is in support of parties potentially on all sides to help them have the ability to navigate this more effectively.
Yeah, perfect.
I think that's a great one. That was a great conflict to think about the role of teacher in. So let's go to the role of bridge builder. And I think this was Ayaku, Ian, Janet, and Maki. Anyone want to talk about who you were bridge building with?
Okay, so we discussed about the LGBTQ differences at school. But we were confused at the beginning between mediator and bridge builders. So we consider that a bridge builder is a agency, organization, or person that works in different groups with a different point of views, so they can explore more in a better setup or in a better environment to explain about the differences of the different perspectives of their point of view. So before to have a mediator, they have learned more ideas or opinions about their position. So when the mediator comes, they can have a better idea and perhaps other arguments to present and find an agreement.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a great example, right? So bridge builders usually are not actually necessarily trying to deal with the actual conflict behavior, right? That might be going to the mediator, but to create connections between the parties. So if you think about all the interventions you may have heard about that are exchange programs, for instance, where you might bring like Israeli and Palestinian youth together. There's a session tomorrow, I think, that's called Peace Players, that's about basketball, using basketball to make connections between parties that are in conflict. So it is not necessarily saying we're going to go do something about the actual conflict that's being, we got peace players cheering happening. Not necessarily about the conflict itself that's happening, right? That behavior in the moment, but it's about what is how do we make connections across people and bring people together so that they're building relationships as a way to facilitate that. So perfect. I think that's a great example. So setting up that mediation, right? You're helping build trust and build relationships so that a mediation can happen to deal with the specific conflict issues in a different step by a different role, right? Playing a different role. Let's go to the Arbiter, group 5. So Adam and Melvin, what were you guys thinking about? What's the role of the Arbiter, and was there a job title you were associating with that?
Hi, everyone. We went again with a Korean conflict as a role, as a mediator. We kind of discussed as a group, who can play this role. We talked about how probably it's an international organization like the UN or regional body that can play a role in mediating, or the role that secondary parties to the conflict, like the US and China, can play as a go-between, as a mediator between the two parties. And Maria or Siyun, would you like to add anything?
So in this case, the one you were talking about, that mediator is in a more formal role, right? So we have mediation in lots of our different court systems and with our local conflicts, but a mediator usually, sometimes it might be informal mediation, but a lot of times they have a more formal position, right? So whether it's because they're another country and so they're coming in and everybody agrees for them to be the mediator, but it is that idea of the mediator doesn't decide, right? The mediator facilitates the parties to decide and asks good questions and might bring information to the table, probably put some social pressure on the different sides to actually be in conversation and decide, but they're not the decider themselves, right? And that's a pretty different role. So thanks. I think that's a great example for that. The arbiter, which is the other one, is a decider, right? So this one might be a judge or someone at a court of arbitration, or someone who might be an appeals process, right? Looking at an appeals process. So an arbiter role is a little bit a different one in that they take in that information, but they usually actually make a decision about the outcome of the conflict. And that obviously takes a little bit different role. Group 6, we're talking about equalizers, and then we're going to go to the room that had 3 or 4 roles to work with. So Angela, NG, Kelly, what is an equalizer? Which conflict were they working in and what were they doing?
So our role was more, I think it was equalizer, and we were a little bit challenged with this actually. We were trying to figure out, what role fit best. And we talked about both issues with Russia and Ukraine and the class conflict, which was the previous subject that I work with. So one area we talked about maybe USA, well, let's start with migrants. So we talked about how in our assumption that this was supposed to be a way that we could kind of equalize the playing field for them. And so maybe that's shows up as someone from Red Cross. We didn't have specific job titles, but we tried to think about a broader area maybe. So like USAID, Red Cross, maybe a social worker, I'm not really sure. And then we tried to look at Russia and Ukraine, and that might have been sort of like the European EU intervention or the UN resolution. Those were some of the things that we thought maybe on a broader scale.
Yeah.
Inge might want to elaborate or make a comment. I'm not sure if I got it all right.
She gave you a thumbs up. Yeah. This is a complicated one because I think it shows up in different ways. And so sometimes it might be, like you said, a UN resolution or something else that disrupts the very Russia powerful, Ukraine not as much, right, dynamic. Sometimes in good ways, sometimes in bad ways, right? As someone who does conflict, that's not always great to have thrown in additional resources into the conflict, depending on what you're up to. I think of this also a lot as activists. Who there may be lower power parties, right? So they're parties that don't have inherently political power of their own, or maybe they just don't have the time or the resources to advocate for themselves. But by bringing in external power or bringing in someone who's from a more privileged group who's coming in to raise issues with, hopefully not just for, but with people who have issues like that. An example, a group I worked with, there was a day labor center out in Centerville, and there was a group of volunteers who frankly were middle-class white folks who recognized that they had a lot more power in that community to try to get the resources for the day laborers in their community. And they very consciously were using that power to try to make sure that any of the wage theft issues from these day laborers were being dealt with. And they were doing it through, we may not all agree, but with a kind of a public shaming, right, of businesses and organizations that were stealing wages from these folks. And so they were seeing and recognizing from their own place of privilege what they could do to help change that power imbalance. Whether or not their tactic was a good one, I'll leave for other folks to discuss. But really thinking about how do we change power dynamics. And for me, I usually think of activists when I think of this. So I think there might be ways that it could be a more or less one-sided intervention, that you're working on. And some of this might be teaching, and being a provider also sometimes helps to deal with that power imbalance. So cool. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Angie. All right. The group in the room that is had a couple different ones to work on. You want to talk about one of the roles that you guys talked about, or a couple of them, and how you thought they might play out?
Me and my group, we chose the healer.
Cool.
And usually the healer in a conflict revolving around harassment will probably be the person who acknowledges what went wrong or the issue, and they would most likely be the one to ask questions and probably look towards, apology, probably addressing the issue and telling the person how they can change or go about it a different way that's good for everyone in the situation.
Nice. So thinking about some of the reconciliation and how do we bring people together and provide avenues for healing in the aftermath of conflict. Cool. Yeah, and it could be, sometimes healers might be professional folks like counselors or other people, but they may also be just community members who, like you said, are willing to recognize and acknowledge trauma and harm and help people move to the next step. Thanks. Any other ones? I know you guys worked on a couple. Who else wants to talk about it?
You want to say? About witness? We talked about witness. Witness?
Yeah, witness. Okay, cool.
For harassment, we also chose witness, and a witness is the person who was around or who was involved in the situation, like willingly or just by coincidence. And we chose that they either write a statement for what happened, or if they decide not to talk, they could just sit there and like I do not agree to.
Yeah, I mean, witness is a really interesting one because if you think about it, there's both the kind of technical piece of having witnessed, but there's also impacting people's behavior because they're being watched, right? So if you think about the role that an organization like Human Rights Watch plays, they are intending to impact the behavior of people engaging in conflict because they're going to go write it down, right? And they're going to write it down and they're going to publish it and say, this is what you did. And so, a lot of the conversations we have about bystanders, and, we've been doing a ton of training with youth in bystander interventions. What do you do when, someone's bullied in front of you, right? And as a bystander, as that witness, that's a super important role. So there's both the kind of technical, are you going to bring forward your information and share it? And there's also this role of if somebody's watching, will I behave differently? And I may well, right? And I might feel a lot of social pressure. I might feel some very technical, even punitive pressure, the ability to get punished because there is someone witnessing that behavior. So it's a super interesting role, and one that a lot of media and journalists play, right? Which is why media and journalists are often one of the first groups that are targeted by organizations that are trying to manage their own power, right? Is that they are playing that witness role. Cool. Thanks for taking that one. Did anybody do referee or peacekeeper?
We also did Peacekeeper.
Okay. What did you think about that?
So with harassment being in mind, the Peacekeeper I thought would normally try to protect the person that's getting harassed. So they will go try to provide protection or either distract the other person, be like, hey, don't say that, or hey, do this real quick, or just be around just in case, so they could just speak back and prevent the harassment and make the other person understand that, hey, this person is obviously uncomfortable with what you're doing, you should stop, and just explaining it to them in a way that they understand that these comments / jokes are not really making this other person feel wanted.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great example, right? So a peacekeeper is generally going to get involved in the moment and try to intervene to stop whatever's happening. So that was a great example at a local level. At an international level, right? Peacekeepers are putting physical bodies of people who have some arms and the ability to protect themselves between parties that are at war, right? Or in conflict. And so enforcing the stopping the behavior, whether it's violent conflict or other things. So I think that's a great example for the harassment of someone who's not just watching it, right, as a witness is, but is actually stepping in the moment and trying to stop the behavior and potentially make some difference with people in the longer term. Cool. Thank you. Did I miss any? Did anybody have a good conversation you want to make sure that I get? Good. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you all doing this with me today and going through and thinking about what are some of the kind of big conflicts that that impact people in their everyday, and what are some of the strategies that we can do for dealing with them. I put in the chat, I put a Google Slides link. So if you want the couple slides that I showed with just some of those roles, you're definitely welcome to them. I will hang out for a little bit if you have individual questions, but if not, I think we have reached the end of the time together. Thank you so much for participating and being here. And I'm happy. I'll put my email in the chat also. So if there's specific questions or follow-up that anybody wants to do, I'm happy to do that. And please make sure that you join other Peace Week events as we go throughout the week. Thanks so much.